Peter sent me a list of his various things he's been involved in. And he just told me, he said, please shorten this, but I can't. So hang in there, Peter. Dr. Peter Blaze Corcoran, Professor Emeritus of Environmental Studies and Environmental Education at Florida Gulf Coast University. Began his career as a teaching principal in a public alternative elementary school known for curriculum of arts, nature, and democracy. He has been a faculty member at College of the Atlantic, Swarthmore College, and Bates College. He has held appointments as a visiting professor at universities in Australia, the Netherlands, Fiji, Malaysia, and Kenya. He has long served as a research fellow at the Earth Charter Center for Education for Sustainable Development at University for Peace in San Jose, Costa Rica, and a senior advisor to Unity Earth in Melbourne, Australia. He's a real international guy, isn't he? He is a past president of the North American Association for Environmental Education. The Earth Ethics Institute at Miami-Dade College has designated him as an elder. New post since I think that's a different document. I'm an elder. New post since his recent retirement includes appointments as a board member at the International Council for Environmental Economics and Development in New York City. These are long titles. Long titles.
Don't have to read them all.
No, I think they're fun. He is a board member for the Francis Perkins Center in Newcastle, Maine. He is a grant selection council member of Purpose Earth, a new organization which supports communities and environmental activism worldwide. In 2020, University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, appointed him as an adjunct professor of environmental and sustainability education. He continues engaged scholarship on a range of topics, including education, indigeneity, I was having trouble with that word, and spirituality, through various chapters, journals, articles, and lectures. His most recent books include Envisioning Futures for Environmental and Sustainability Education and Intergenerational Learning and Transformative Leadership for Sustainable Futures. That's a long title. Getting to know Peter is like having a friend forever. He is the most charming man I've known outside my husband for a long time. He's watching. He's supposed to be watching. Anyway, you feel like Peter's an old friend once you've gotten to have a few conversations with him. So, old friend, will you come please give us a talk?
And Zoom participants, just so you know, we have muted you all. Just please remain muted until there's probably an opportunity for questions at the end, and then you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
I just put my Francis Perkins hat on for a moment. And I want to welcome a special guest who's not going to be able to be with us for the whole time. Tomlin, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Wild Meadows.
Wonderful to be here with you all.
Can we see you momentarily or not?
Yeah, but I can't see myself, so I don't
Okay,
know.
that's okay. We can see you and your beautiful plant. Tomlin's going to have to move on to another obligation, but Tomlin is the grandson of Francis Perkins. Oh. So welcome to St. Michael. And he was originally scheduled to be on Sanibel this week, and I was going to have him jump out of a box or something. the Episcopal Church women, but that didn't work out. Is my mic working? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Modell, and all who've invited me to speak over the last 3 years. I finally get to meet the Episcopal Church women and talk with you about one of your own, Frances Perkins, an Episcopal Church woman. So the plan today is I'd like to start with an invocation, and then I have a few photographs and quotations to introduce you to give you a feeling for Frances Perkins as a person, and then I'll share, brief lecture, my thoughts on her life and the example of her life. And then we'll close with praying the Frances Perkins prayer together. This was unrehearsed. I think it's great. Modell's going to lead us, and it'll be nice to hear that prayer again. We'll say it together after knowing a little more about her. And then that leaves time for observations, comments, questions from you. Okay? Great. Let us pray. Inspired by her faith, Frances Perkins envisioned and fought for social justice, fair and safe conditions of labor, and the alleviation of poverty. As the first woman in American history to serve as a cabinet secretary and as architect of the New Deal, she has earned a place in the pantheon of our republic. We have gathered here at St. Michael and All Angels today to reflect on her life and her legacy. May our efforts going forward be blessed with her insight and wisdom. As the Frances Perkins prayer invites, help us, following her example and in union with her prayers, to contend fairly for justice and the protection of all. Amen. And I think, we have someone who's not on mute, Sue? Or?
We are getting the screen share up right now.
Good.
Took care of that little echo.
Thank you for that. So the title of my talk, and welcome Zoomers, we'll lose you for a minute there. We're just going to go through a few slides and then we'll come back to the moment. But the title of the talk, of course, is A Working Woman, U.S. Secretary of Labor, and Holy Woman of the Episcopal Church. We'll do that in reverse order. We'll start with the Holy Woman. And Sue will go on to...
Just a little delay here.
No worries.
What's the date on that?
Oh,
Just for curiosity.
Time Magazine, 1933.
Okay.
That's when she took office. All right, and I'm going to tell a wonderful story about the experience that she had deciding whether or not to accept Roosevelt's offer. So she began, presidency started then in March. She began with Roosevelt in March of 1933, and that's when she was on the cover of Time. And she served through his entire presidency. She was one of only two who served until he died. This is probably the longest quote of the day, but I wanted to start by giving you a sense of her theology. And this is from a scholar named Charles Hoffacker, who's on the board of this Frances Perkins Center that was mentioned. And he's written, "We recognize a creator who continues to create, who supplies and sustains abundance, abundant nature and grace and glory. This basic and essential theology has societal ramifications. It produces a politics of generosity, not a politics of righteousness. Instead of enforcing social discipline, it emphasizes social provision. This is the authentic message of the scriptures and that Christian tradition. This is what Frances Perkins embraced as an Episcopalian and an Anglo-Catholic from that tradition. Through her efforts as public servant and prophetic witness, This foundational theology and its politics of generosity came to have a tremendous influence for good on millions and millions of lives and continues to do so. So this was the basic idea that she had, was that as Christians, it's about Christ incarnate in this world with us. And she saw the face of Jesus in everyone, it said. Don't you love that photograph? She's testifying before Congress. It looks like the divine light is.
Looks like the Annunciation.
She was a feminist. It's often asked if she was a feminist. And of course, it may have had a very different meaning when she said this a long time ago. But she said, feminism means revolution, and I am a revolutionist. I believe in revolution as a principle. It does good for everybody. So she was a radical, and I'll talk about that. She was a socialist before she was a Democrat. She had ambivalent feelings about her rise in authority. And the story I'll tell will demonstrate that. She was not ambitious, but her grandmother had encouraged her always to go through open doors. And she said, the door might not be opened to a woman again for a long, long time. And I had a kind of duty to other women to walk in and sit down on the chair that was offered, and so establish the right of others long hence and far distant in geography to sit in the high seats. And she really felt obliged. And she, of course, it was the highest seat. I mean, she was the first woman in American history to serve in a cabinet position. A famous quote, I came to Washington to work for God, FDR, and the millions of forgotten, plain, common working men. And I'll explain a bit about her history as a social reformer in my lecture. This, by the way, is the definitive biography of Frances Perkins. There's a copy of it here on the table. It's the one to read if you're interested in finding out more about her life. And Kirsten Downey is a member of our board at the Frances Perkins Center and a very good biographer. The other photograph is the homestead in Maine, and we have someone from Newcastle, Maine here. And Yarmouth, yes, Carol. And is this a bad thing to say? We bought the farm? The center recently purchased the homestead from Tomlin, who you met a minute ago. And so we're a private nonprofit group that is committed to extending her legacy. The farm, I won't say much about this in the lecture, but it had a tremendous influence on her, as Maine does, right? She was born in Boston, but we don't hold that against her. She came to Maine every chance she could, and often in the summer. And in those days, of course, people left Washington in the summer. And she came to Maine. But she also spent a lot of time growing up there. We're discovering more and more these aspects of Frances Perkins. You know, she hasn't been studied much. She's really been overlooked by history. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that she was a woman. And let's face it, most of the people who've been writing have been men. But as we do more research on Frances, we're discovering more and more. One of the things is how committed she was to the arts. I mean, she loved the arts herself, and her daughter became an artist. But she was the one who convinced the WPA to include artists in the stipends and the work that was created by the Works Progress Administration. I would like to see the people who are poets and artists take it up and tell us what ought to be American life, what ought to be American manners, what ought to be the way in which we should behave toward each other. How shall we curb our greed? How shall we reduce our own arrogance and pride? How shall we cultivate those instincts of brotherliness and comradeliness which are necessary for the full development of a good society in this country? She really believed in the centrality of the arts to a full and rich life. And she did not have good relationship with the press. She was a very private person, and she had a hard time. She was impeached by Congress because of her political views and so on. Not removed from office, but impeached. Anyway, she said, I'll let history judge my record, not the newspaper boys. They didn't like her very much, and she didn't like them very much. And it's also, I think, a contributing factor to her being overlooked, is that she didn't enjoy good relations with the press. And just for fun, this is a new portrait of Frances Perkins. It's at the Sanibel Library right now. Mira Roberts did it. And some of you were there the other night when I had the chance to give a little mini lecture on Frances. And it's just so much fun to see Frances in sequins. She was not a person who was into sequins. She wore a black frock. She wore a tricorn hat. She underemphasized her femininity, and she was not a fancy. She didn't want to be. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. Indeed, she wanted to relate to men in many ways as if she was their mother. But that's a whole other story. We'll save the last slide, Sue, for the end. It's the prayer. And so now we can go back to our Zoom friends, and I'll give a little lecture. All right, and we'll do it in reverse order. So Holy Woman, and then to becoming U.S. Secretary of Labor, longest serving in American history. It has been written that she was the most important single cabinet member in American history. You think of all states and all those important departments. And working mother, she contended with all the challenges that women face in balancing responsibility to extended family, spouse, children, professional life, and societal expectations. And I want to include that because it makes her accomplishments all the more remarkable. So who was this holy woman of the Episcopal Church? She was raised in New England Congregationalism, but she was a faithful Episcopalian through her adult life. At different periods, she participated in parishes in several states and the District of Columbia. And in her busiest years as labor secretary, she would spend a day or two each month in retreat at an Episcopal convent in Maryland. She rarely spoke or wrote publicly about her faith, but she was deeply religious. I'm trying to think of the source of this. It might have been Kirsten Downey who wrote the biography. She was, the women who cleaned at the convent, the nuns, said they would often find her on her knees. They would wash the floor around her. She was devout. And her faith had a great deal to do with her concept of public service. And as Father Bill said, the Episcopal Church's General Convention has established her feast day. And we will close with a prayer that they adopted. She was commemorated, by the way, as a public servant and a prophetic witness. Okay, so scholars, including Hofecker, who gave us that long, wonderful quote at the beginning, places Frances squarely in the Anglican tradition of public responsibility, of taking an active place in the cloud of witnesses who shape church history. He gives her a very high seat in Episcopal and Anglican thinking as well. She really shaped, in some ways, of course, society. And I think we're just beginning to think about how she might shape and continue to shape church history. Hoffaker has said elsewhere, Perkins was a high church Episcopalian who emphasized Christ's incarnation and his sacraments and looked for Jesus in the face of every person, as I said. End quote. Much of what we know of her faith journey and her theology is from a series of lectures that she gave in 1948. This is after she was secretary. At St. Thomas Fifth Avenue in New York, it was a public series of lectures. Fortunately, she kept all her notes. We know exactly what she said. These have just been rediscovered, and they're in a new book, or a new book draws on them a lot. It's called Tread the City Streets Again. If you're really interested in her theology, it's interesting to read those lectures. But Hoffaker, again, I turn to him, describes her theology this way in terms of the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. The theology of Francis Perkins is based on the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ and how the enjoyment of eternal life with God is the purpose of every human person. Her lectures address social, political, and economic aspects of this theology while providing insight into her own practice of prayer. He writes, she is an outstanding representative of the Episcopal Church's Anglo-Catholic tradition, which at its best promotes social and economic justice as an essential element of the Gospels. And for those maybe on Zoom, I know we have some folks who aren't Episcopalian and whatnot. This concept of the incarnation is that God reaches out to all parts of the earth and that we live in the incarnate life of God in the secular and worldly. That God is with us, becomes consecrated to our everyday lives, become consecrated to God. Is that acceptable, Father Bill?
That's a wonderful description.
Okay. That whole notion of in the incarnate life of God. And she lived by that. An example, a quote from Francis, that poverty is preventable, that poverty is destructive, wasteful, demoralizing, and morally unacceptable in a Christian and democratic society. She was really motivated by her concern for the poor, as was Jesus. And that really drove her theologically, and she brought that to her work life. Her road, we'll switch now to Secretary of Labor, her road to the high chair began at Mount Holyoke College. Any Mount Holyoke women here? Oh, gosh. She was deeply influenced by the women at Mount Holyoke. One professor in particular who, good Lord, a long time ago, brought the women in the class to the factories in Lawrence, and they could see the conditions of labor. This was in sociology. She was actually studying sciences. She had a very scientific mind, but she took this course that changed her life. And she had no idea. She'd grown up near there. She spent a lot of her childhood in Worcester. The family she grew up in, New England Congregationalists, I'm one, so I can talk about them, thought that people who were poor were drunk or unambitious or lazy, and it opened the whole world to her, this course, that she realized that people were poor for a lot of reasons that had nothing to do with choices that they had made.
Just today is the anniversary of one of those terrible Bell fires.
Wow.
For so many immigrant young women.
Yeah.
Today, over hundreds.
Yes, and now a remarkable life experience, I'll mention it right now. Well, thank you for bringing that up. She was having, I'm jumping ahead now, years later, she was having tea in New York City when they heard the fire engines, and she and her colleagues witnessed the shirtwaist factory fire. They went to Washington Square and saw those young women and girls jumping from the 8th and 9th floor. They went right through the nets that were meant to catch them. The exit was locked at the factory because someone had been stealing scraps of cloth, and 179 people died in that fire. And these experiences, seeing the factories, seeing that fire, this drove her to be the force and the expert behind safe labor conditions. And New York State led the way. She was also, before I get to her as commissioner, industrial commissioner in New York, I'll just say a bit about her earlier experiences. She knew Jane Addams. She lived at, she was in the Settle House movement. She lived for a while at Hull House in Chicago. So, and she was a suffragette. And, we've come a long way in 100 years, but it's important to remember how brave the suffragettes were. I mean, men would throw garbage at them. They were ridiculed. She literally had she and another woman, she had a soapbox that she literally was carried by another woman. She would get up on the soapbox and argue in favor of the right to vote for women. And it was dangerous, but she had a very brave and effective career in the National Consumers League. That was where she went to work. And she would do things like go to the train station in Philadelphia where women from the South were being brought up, and there would be men there who would offer these women, a place to stay and all that, and they were drawing them into prostitution. She was a social worker, but she was very brave, and she would publish the names of the men who were doing this, and she was followed in the streets at night on occasion, and she was a really brave person in terms of her beliefs. So she became quite well known. She did graduate work at the University of Pennsylvania. She started at Wharton, the business school. She started in finance and commerce, as it was called then, and then she went on to do a master's in sociology and economics at Columbia University. And her master's thesis was on hunger in a public school, one of the PS schools in West 46th Street. So she had a strong academic background from Mount Holyoke and these fine universities. She had a great deal of courage and personal commitment and faith, and she had experiences that prepared her for major roles in government. And so she was appointed to the Industrial Commission of New York State by Governor Al Smith. They had a very good relationship. They mentored each other. And it's important to recognize that Frances Perkins' rise was not based on a connection to any man. So many women became well known because their husband, because their father, something like that. Frances Perkins did it on her own, even though she worked well with men. And I was telling Modell before, she studied how men think. Not that we all think alike, but she really understood a lot about how men think. Through her early career, she advocated for a dramatic change in the relationships between men and women. She was exceptionally capable of putting her ideas into practice as a social reformer, policymaker, government official. She wrote, I had already had a conviction about social justice, and it was clear in my own mind. But it was clear also that the promotion of social justice could be made to work practically, end quote. And this was really her gift. I mean, she created many of these programs out of whole cloth, thin air. I mean, it was amazing. Social Security, how are you going to keep track of people's earnings? I mean, it was an extraordinary accomplishment. And Social Security has worked very well over the years. I mean, it's been it was a very successful organization. Anyway, she was the highest ranking woman at several levels as she rose up in New York State. And she went from working for Governor Al Smith to Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they worked together for 20 years before he offered her the position. And here's the little story about becoming Secretary of Labor. Between his election in 32 and his inauguration in March of 33, he was putting together the cabinet. Now, think about what the country was like in 1932. 45% unemployment. Banks closing. Your life savings gone. The bank closed. There was no federal protection or insurance for, I mean, it was really an extraordinary time in American history. And she was shy about taking the appointment. He invited her to Roosevelt House in New York, his home, with his mother and his wife, Eleanor. And he wanted her to accept, and she was not at all sure that she ought to. And she brought a famous list with her. And she said, and this is a quote she later wrote down. She said to Franklin Roosevelt, "You won't want me for Secretary of Labor if you don't want these things done. You won't want me for Secretary of Labor if you don't want these things done." Now, what was on Frances Perkins' list? 1932. What do you suppose was on the list of things that she wanted to work on with Roosevelt?
Elections for everyone.
Pardon?
Elections for everyone.
Well, she was very strong on democracy, that's for sure, but she didn't work in that area. What? Any other ideas? Pardon? And any
Equal pay.
equal pay, other things that might have been on that list in terms of New Deal? Jobs, job creation. Amazing list. Child protection laws, which did not exist at the federal level. They did at some state levels. Sorry, is my mic okay? Federal laws banning child labor. Workers' compensation. Minimum wage. There was no minimum wage. Right to, you know, that the right to bargain collectively was not on the list, but it was one of her accomplishments. I was going to mention that. Interesting. It was not on the original list, but it's one of her, she accomplished things that weren't on the list even. Direct federal aid for unemployment relief, a revitalized public employment service, 40-hour work week. If there were laws, they were mostly 54 hours. She argued for the 40-hour work week. And that's when they said she's a socialist. Because that was something that the Socialist Party had called for a long time. And national health insurance. And national health insurance. So Roosevelt said he'd back her. And in the next 12 years, of course, they accomplished everything except the national health and other things, like the right to bargain collectively. So she really is the architect of the New Deal. And that, they made it up as they went along. That list was as close, according to her biographers who studied her papers and studied the New Deal, that list was as close to an agenda for the New Deal as there was. They really figured things out as they went along. And she was very good at that, her practicality. She was very good at that. For example, that problem of keeping track of wages and everything, she went to some young guys who were starting a new company called IBM. And she was very good at bringing out the best in other people. And she delegated very effectively. She loved to find bright young people and work with them. Finally, working mother. Frances Perkins' family life was very challenging. She was far more progressive than her parents. Thank God she didn't become a Catholic. They might not have survived that, but becoming an Episcopalian was a pretty big deal. So she had some issues there. She was married late, kept her name when she married, if you can imagine in that time. She had the marriage was difficult. They considered separation. She had a stillborn child. She had a miscarriage. But then she had a daughter, and they decided to stay together. Unfortunately, her husband lost the fortune, his family's fortune, in a poor investment scheme. And most challenging of all, perhaps, was that her husband and later her daughter had serious mental health problems. They had bipolar disorder. And her husband spent a lot of his years in a sanitarium. She visited him. But here's the interesting part. She had to work. There was he had no income, and there was no family wealth. So she really worked. And she earned her jobs. I mean, she was exceptionally well qualified. At the time that Roosevelt offered her this position as Secretary of Labor, she was perhaps the most knowledgeable person in the country on those issues, including unemployment. She challenged President Hoover when she was industrial commissioner in New York. She said that the unemployment figures that the government was putting out were vastly underestimated unemployment. And she really knew what she was talking about. So in sum, and then we'll have a prayer and some questions and comments. In sum, Perkins was a person of great faith and great faith in action. Her conscious, reflexive, and disciplined faith journey led her through one of the most difficult periods in American history. She was really the visionary who reinvented American government. It's certainly government as we've known it. And I think that the importance of her accomplishments to history are quite astonishing. For example, last year, during the height of our own pandemic crisis and unemployment, there were 68 million people on Social Security in the United States and 23 million on unemployment insurance. This is last year in the United States. That's 100 million people. And what would those 100 million people have been doing without the social insurance? It's a towering accomplishment. Alongside, of course, her head of household earning responsibilities, difficult spousal issues, and mothering challenges. I believe her career can be a model for us in times like these when social and public services are profoundly tested. Her reimagining of the federal government's responsibility to provide for all its people with the best possible life is still highly relevant now, I think, as we face environmental, health, social, political, and economic crises. I believe her bold thinking, advocacy, and action on behalf of working people is just what we need at this critical moment. I think it's a time for Frances Perkins-like thinking. She created these programs that did not exist out of a deep humanity and concern for the poor. And she created them out of an Episcopal faith tradition that we might hope to uphold. Thank you.
And Peter Jean wanted you to know that she attended Mount Holyoke.
Hey, there's always one. That's always one. And Modell is going to lead us in the Frances Perkins prayer. And
Okay, would you like that up for you?
we have it up there. And I don't have hard copies, unfortunately, but it's here on the screen.
Would you like to do that now? Or
Sure.
would you like to take some questions?
Your choice. You're the boss.
Why don't we do questions first?
And close with a prayer.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay.
Excellent. Excellent. Are boys allowed to ask questions?
Yeah.
Jim.
Sorry. First off, if you'd asked me before this was who Frances Perkins, I would not have had a clue. This is a life-changing experience to be exposed to that, and exposed through you.
Amen.
However, my question is, Social Security specifically excluded domestic workers and farm workers in order to get the Southern votes that were needed to pass Social Security. How did she deal with that challenge?
It's a very good question, and there's a lot of, scholars are doing a lot of critical analysis, not just of that, but of other New Deal deals that left out certain people like African Americans. Social Security didn't leave out African Americans, but some other programs did. And it's legitimate scholarship. Frances Perkins was a half a loaf person. She believed that it was better to get a half a loaf when you're hungry than no loaf at all. And Roosevelt was the same. They were willing to settle for what they could get. And that Southern bloc of senators was very hard. It's like kind of the gridlock we face, that Biden faces, trying to get things through. It's a tough crowd. And they took what they could get. I think that's my simple answer.
Thank you.
She was very aware of the shortcomings, by the way. That her papers show that. So it's not that she didn't think of these things. They knew what they were doing, and they knew what they could get.
Thank you.
Comments, questions? Don't have to be questions.
Was she not a contemporary of Ayn Rand?
I think Ayn Rand was later. I'm not a scholar of Ayn Rand, but Ayn Rand would have come into the 50s and 60s. Yeah. Did you want to make a comment on that?
I think it would have been interesting to have the two of them get together and have a discussion. I would like to have been a fly on the wall and listen to that.
She didn't enjoin public debate very often. She really kept her nose down at her and worked. She was a very, very hard worker. One thing that we're thinking about a lot at the Frances Perkins Center right now, I have the privilege of co-chairing. Is Professor Bryseth with us still? Yes. Professor Bryseth. Now this, I'm co-chair with Professor Bryseth of a committee that's looking at the education programs at the center. One of the things there are several interesting things that are emerging. Chris, I may call on you, Professor. One of the things that's emerging is the way that Frances Perkins got things done. She was terrific. And this is common to us now because I think our culture is much less hierarchical than it used to be. But she was very good at getting people together and bringing out the best ideas and listening. And I think this has a lot to do with gender. She listened. She listened to other people. Now I'll tell you a secret about President Bryseth there. He knew Frances Perkins. One of her most interesting periods was after she retired from the labor position and after she finished with the Civil Service Commission, she went to teach at Cornell. And you were just a child, right?
Still am.
Professor, would you like to make any comment?
Well, we were, I lived at a place called Telluride House at Cornell, which is a kind of academic community of undergraduates and graduates, and we invited faculty guests. And when we discovered Ms. Perkins, we asked her to come down for dinner one night. And I remember asking, to get the question period started, what was your most important accomplishment? And she had two words. She said, Social Security. And we followed that up with a kind of Russian dinner. We decided it would be great if she would come to live with us. So we arranged with her boss at the Industrial Relations School to work this all out, and she came to dinner. And afterwards, I took her up to the room that she would have, warning her that she was right above the music room, and there would be Bach, Bartok, and Brubeck at any time of the night. We didn't know how deaf she was at the time, so it was really not an issue. When she went home that night with Professor Neufeld, she said, "Do you know what those boys have done?" And he said, "Yes, Miss Perkins." She said, "I feel like a bride on her wedding night." So her last 5 years of her life, she lived with us. And during that period, it should be noted that Telluride House became the first residence on American College campus to be co-ed. And when I came, happened to be going to Oxford for 2 years. When I came back, this had been accomplished. And she said, "What do you think?" I said, "I'm all for it." She says, "You know, you boys will be sorry." I said, "Why?" She said, because the women will take over. Anyway, she and I put together a seminar with Henry Wallace, and then we did one with James Farley. So I had, as a young middle 20s graduate student, had a chance to moderate discussions among these three major New Dealers. She was spicy and very. I just discovered a letter of mine, which I shared with Peter. This was in August of 1960, just after the Democratic Convention that nominated Jack Kennedy. And I wrote to my friend, Frances Perkins, was here the other night. And when Rod asked her if she agreed with Harry Truman about Kennedy, she said, "No!" Exclamation. Mr. Truman and I are about the same age, and it's a characteristic of older people to distrust younger men. I was a better man when I was 43 than I am now. Then I had courage and acted. Now I have wisdom and caution. And better man then is a very interesting quotation. Kennedy, of course, was 43. And she was Truman's characterization of Kennedy as too young, and he was too unseasoned to be president. Anyway, thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Chris. And so what we're doing now is thinking about what the programs ought to be to extend her legacy and strengthen it. And we're doing a lot of things online. There are some materials on the table about the Frances Perkins Center, and join us online. We do public forums. We even do our garden party online now these days. And but we're thinking a lot about the dimensions. She is so multidimensional. One of the things, and we don't have enough time to talk about it here, but one of the things that surprised me, and I think maybe Professor Bryseth as well, is how interested people are in her spirituality, given our conversation today. You know, when we started that, I thought it would be more about labor, you know, and more about women. But people are deeply interested in her spirituality, and I think it goes with the spiritual hunger in society today. And she's an example of a person who put her spirituality into action in a profoundly successful way without making a big deal about it.
Peter, let me make one comment. We have
Yes, sir.
several times she makes the comment that what she is trying to do through her public work is to create the kingdom of God on earth.
We'll give you that last word. Nancy Kennedy from Maine. Who went to Mount Holyoke? Gene, you went to Mount Holyoke? I should have known. And Fred Moon, welcome. Fred Moon from Fort Myers. And
I went to Mount Holyoke, but it was only to date the girls. I went to...
Oh, Fred, it's wonderful to see you. And Gene and Nancy, it's about 0 degrees in Maine, isn't it?
You're muted, Nancy.
You're on mute, dear.
As we say in Maine, it's no temperature at all.
Oh, well, listen, I'll just, in the interest of time, I think we might go to the prayer, but my hope is that I've shared today the inspiration of an Episcopal Church woman. And I thank you.
And there was a question on Zoom. We put in the chat the website for the francisperkinscenter.org. And yes, this is being recorded and it'll be posted on our website. And that link is on the chat as well.
Thank you for your tech support.
Yes. So this, and for you too, this recording will be on the website probably this afternoon or tonight. So you can pass the word and people can enjoy it.
Peter, thank you so much for this long delayed lecture. It was worth the wait.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it. Thank you. Now I'd like to lead us in the prayer. Loving God, we bless your name for Francis Perkins, who in faithfulness to our baptism and vision to society, in which all might live in health and peace. Help us to follow your example and in unity praise to contend together with justice and for the perfection of all, that we may be faithful followers of Jesus Christ, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns one God forever and ever. Amen.
Can I just ask Peter one, having done that? The Episcopal Church now has acknowledged she is a holy woman. What did they think of her at the time when she was supporting issues that might not have been seen as acceptable in the Episcopal world of the 30s and 40s?
Oh my gosh, what a good question, Maggie. Did you hear that, Chris?
I did, yes.
I don't have an answer to it. I know she had a lot, and Chris, feel free. I know she had many friends in the hierarchy of the church. Indeed, part of her making this decision to accept Roosevelt's offer, she went to the bishop. She went to her bishop and consulted with him as to whether or not she should accept it. And I think if we look at the context of the country then, there was a lot more tolerance for radical movement than there might have in the social realm, than there might have been in the relatively conservative Episcopal Church earlier. So, but I think this would be a great area of study and interest. What did the church think of her?
Well, the point I would make, Peter, is in Don Mitchell's book, or the essay that he gave when she became a holy woman at St. Andrews in Newcastle. And that is when she's moved from being a Congregationalist to being an Episcopalian when she was in Chicago and working with Jane Addams. It was to move from the Puritan view of the individual, whose individual salvation was what was at stake, and to the Episcopal Church in which the interests of all of God's children were of concern. And this, by the way, was the same movement that Henry Wallace went through from traditional Methodism, where his grandfather was a major Methodist minister. He converted to Episcopalianism as well. And they were very concerned about the poorest of the poor as part of the concern of the church. So the Church of England example, which was after all a state church, was carried over here without being a state church, with an encompassing view of the responsibility of all of us for each other.
Beautiful. Well said. And Nancy, a lot of you know Nancy Kennedy. You may still be on mute, dear, but Nancy goes to that church. The church in Maine is St. Andrew's Church, in Newcastle. And I like to sit in her pew. It gives me inspiration. like good New England Episcopalians, you always sit in the same seat, right? So, all right.
Jennifer, we need to go. Jennifer and I always sit in the same pew.
We always sit together. Well, in the summer you can sit in Francis. Hey, I've got one more thought that just, it's not a closing thought, but it's something of interest to me. I imagine that it helped Francis that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was also an Episcopalian. And he was a man of great faith. And she writes in The Roosevelt I Knew, her book, her only book. She didn't write her own memoirs, but in The Roosevelt I Knew, she talks about Roosevelt having great faith, almost blind faith, unquestioning faith. And I'd really be interested in that dynamic between the two Episcopalian, the two of them. I'm just interested in that. I bet it helped. They had a common language. They had a common faith, I suppose you could say.
Common values.
Yes, and their values were shaped by their faith.
I suspect it would be a lot different if she were more Anglo-Catholic or on the Catholic end. Then she'd, at that stage, really be considered a socialist because that would be more in line. So being Episcopalian, which was an acceptable upper class kind of New York, would have worked for her, would have worked as you're talking about.
And she really pushed, in her own beliefs, she really pushed the Anglo-Catholic. I mean, she would have called herself an Anglo, but she was also very savvy. Mm-hmm. And I think she may have presented herself as less of an Anglo-Catholic socialist than she really was. She was very good at getting things done.
Peter?
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Two points on this last one. All the time I spent with her off and on for 5 years, I never heard her talk about religion. So the fact that in our house, which was a mixture of Protestants and Jews, Catholics, Muslims, we all knew she went to the Episcopal Church on Sunday, but it was never an issue that she talked about. And secondly, I think I went to her funeral, which was at the Church of the Resurrection in New York. It was a very high church funeral. There was no eulogy whatsoever. It could have been about any other person. And it just struck me that that was a choice on her part. It was not about her. In a temporal sense, it was about her relationship to God. And that's what was being dealt with through the high liturgy of the high Episcopal Church, or the Anglo-Catholic Church, as you're referring to.
Thank you. And of course, she planned her own service, so that was not a reflection by others. That was the service that she chose. And there's a famous story about two women walking home from the funeral saying, you know, she would have loved it. And the other woman says, yeah, she wrote it. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Peter.